Welcome to the Saturate Podcast. My name's Brad Watson, and today's episode is going to be awesome. I talk with Dan Bovenmyer, who is a pastor of a multi-site church and a church planting church in Iowa City, Iowa, so the very middle heartbeat of America, and they've been living out and calling people towards everyday mission, even as their Sunday mornings continue to be very attractional. And so I'm going to talk to him about how they welcome new people in and shepherd them towards life-on-life discipleship, how that's hard. We'll get very practical, very nitty-gritty. Dan is a very wise, kind person. Even if you're not in that position of shifting a church, you'll get a lot out of this conversation as he just describes how to be patient, gracious, and challenging to disciples. So you'll want to do that. One of the things that we talk about in this podcast is pilot groups. Pilot groups is a resource that we've put together that helps churches take people through small baby steps and getting them into missional community, forming missional communities. It's a strategy. You can buy the pilot group guide at saturatetheworld.com. Comes with all you need to put that together and even make it your own. And this podcast will be helpful in understanding how to do that. The other thing that I would point you to is there's a whole host of resources. The Transition Starter Kit, it's fantastic. It has Dan Bovenmyer teaches, as well as pastors and leaders that lead all sorts of churches that have transitioned or made shifts to help their disciples live on mission. There's audio, there's video, there's PDFs. It's a great way to get started on this conversation. Tons and tons of wisdom. So hope that you are able to check that out as well. So let's dive into this combo with Dan.
This is the Saturate Podcast. Saturate is committed to seeing a gospel movement happen in North America and beyond, in which every man, woman, and child have a daily encounter with Jesus in word and deed. This podcast is an ongoing conversation with disciples and leaders growing in the gospel and growing in living the implications of the gospel in community and on mission.
All right, welcome to the podcast, Dan. How are you doing?
Doing great, man. How are you today?
I'm pretty swell. Yeah, I'm pretty good. I'm headed to Australia in a couple days, so that sounds fun to say.
Yeah, it does. I have a million questions. Like,
okay.
Australia, is this the first time?
This is the first time. It's like first time, long time. I've wanted to go for a long time, and I'm going to Melbourne only, and I'm going to be hanging out, spending time with, encouraging, working with two churches. So shout out to them, Next Door Church and Inner West, and I'm excited.
That is awesome. Do you have any personal plans, or is there any places you have to see while you're in Australia?
So the extent of my personal plans is I have a list of coffee shops to go to in Melbourne because it's like the competitor with like the Pacific Northwest in great coffee.
Yeah.
And so I'm really stoked to go to some of the finer establishments. But yeah, I'll basically only have one day when I'm not doing a bunch of stuff. So I just love living the normal life when I travel too. So being immersed, if you will.
Got it. So you're like, do you go look for markets and just kind of tour the streets and get a feel of the city, or what does that mean to you?
I mean, when you put it that way, it sounds very like Apostle Paul, but I just go to the markets and then I reason with the Epicureans. And they laugh at me and say, "You fool! You believe in the resurrection." But yeah, that's what I do. I like going to the markets. I like going to just trying to do normal life. Yeah, that's awesome. That's my jam.
I whenever I'm in a new country, I like to go find wherever the food supply is just to get a feel of people. So I always love like going down streets and going to like not the tourist spots, but what does the normal everyday person eat? What do they, what does this look like? So
right,
that's what I meant.
No, I know. I probably wouldn't have caught that if that's not part of my teaching that I'm doing in Australia. So
that's awesome. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just this is your second time on the podcast.
Yes, sir.
But it's been a long time, like 2 years. So I'd love for our listeners to get to know you once again. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your church, kind of what God's been doing with you these last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. I am been a pastor here at Grace Community Church in the suburbs of Iowa City, Iowa. We're technically in North Liberty, Iowa, and been here for, it's actually been 9 years now.
Awesome.
I was actually prior to that involved in a house church network that I helped launch and form. And we were growing and learning a lot. And about 9 years ago, went through the process of joining into Grace and merging the two together. So since then at Grace, I've been very involved in and interested in discipleship and missional community. We call them community groups here. And also just church planting. So we just launched our sent off our third church plant here since I've been here.
That's awesome.
And God seems to be opening up doors for us. We're in a university town. Iowa City is home of the Hawkeyes. So Hawkeye football is like the biggest sport in the state of Iowa. Kind of like Nebraska football is the biggest thing in Nebraska. And we also have a really famous wrestling team here. So we're kind of the big city in the farm country of Iowa. So we've been launching out church plants to small towns nearby. We're sending out autonomous teams that are doing their thing. And it's been interesting because all of them have the common theme of they just started practicing some missional community in their little towns, and people just started coming from everywhere to see what's going on. And so we don't have a real great strategy per se, just that we're trying to practice the basics of faith, and as people are living out life, that people see life change, and maybe neighbors that they've known for 20 years are going, what's going on with you? So that's launching into churches. So it's really encouraging. Awesome. We're still learning as we're going, but the latest one is in Riverside, Iowa, which is a small casino town just south of here. And they call it River City. I'm so excited, and a couple of my dear friends are down there leading it out. So
that's awesome.
Love those guys. What else do you want to know? Is that it? Is that enough?
No, that's great. Yeah. I mean, that just leads me to so many more questions. But maybe what's Grace Community like just as a church? If you could help people visualize it.
Totally.
The people there.
Yeah, it's an interesting church. Iowa's an interesting place. It's if you've not been here and you're a flyover person, there's a long heritage of farming across all of Iowa. And Iowa had a controversial history of pushing out, of course, the indigenous Indians, and then had these groups of people, mostly from Scandinavia, that formed small towns all over Iowa. So you'll have a German town that's almost everyone has German roots. You'll have another town that almost everyone has Norwegian roots. Often one person would come and then would be joined by family or other people that knew them that would come over here. It's a really interesting culture, agrarian culture. And then you have some bigger towns that have popped up around the industry of farming in the area. And then there's university towns. And so we're not in the agrarian town category as much as that we're a university town. The city of Iowa City is the most liberal city in Iowa. I would say it's right up there with like a Madison, Wisconsin. And so there is a very post-Christian, post-modern viewpoint in a lot of Iowa City. I live in the thick of the town, and I moved to Iowa City because of my interest and I had kind of felt called towards people that were in a postmodern, post-Christian mindset. And so in my own personal culture, the school we go to is in the thick of Iowa City. My neighbors, while they know I'm a Christian, most of them are like, well, we've moved on from that. We're doing more advanced stuff now. Which is different than almost every other town in Iowa. Most of them are very small, conservative, traditional towns that have the Methodist and Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So the people that come to Grace, oftentimes the post-Christians aren't necessarily flooding in the doors. And so we've been working on what does that look like? We have a church downtown that we call the Downtown Church, and they have been focusing much more that direction. And then the church that I'm currently at primarily is in North Liberty in the suburbs. And you see a lot of people coming in here that are coming from probably looking for more conservative theology and coming in with a lot of that viewpoint and that assumptions. So we're sort of a little bit more suburban in the really big campus that we have.
Cool. So you have there's two campuses in this college town, one suburban, one downtown.
That's right.
Yeah. I think the only other key thing that people need to know about you is you are a fellow unique colored glasses person.
Yes. I love your glasses, Brad, by the way. I fully approve.
Thank you. They were red. So I've been red for like 5 years. Yeah.
I've considered this, and I think I even thought, I don't think I'm going to get red glasses because that's Brad's area. And I didn't even know you, but I was aware of you. And I was like, I like the color blue. It fits my personality. Do people stop you and talk to you about your glasses?
Oh yeah, very often. Yeah.
It's a great conversation starter.
It really is. And yeah, I love them. So if it wasn't for that, no one would ever talk to me. So
I doubt that, but I love it. That's great. I love your glasses.
Thanks. Well, it was a major compromise for me. So I don't know what your whole wardrobe is like, but I essentially like to wear black shirts, white t-shirts, or like denim collared shirts. And so my wife, who's Brazilian, was like, you just need a lot of color in your life. You've got to like get accessories, like you're a grown up, and you can't you're not Steve Jobs, all of that. So I was like, oh, well, I'll just get, glasses that have color on them. And then people will think I'm a colorful person, even though I wear the exact same clothes every day, but they'll think I'm stylish. So that's a deep piece of why I wear the glasses.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wish I had that depth. I don't know if I have that depth. I just liked the glasses.
Yeah, that's good.
As an Indian 7, it brought me joy.
That's awesome. Exactly. You touched it, sparked joy. You're good.
That's right. I need this.
That's so great. Well, today we wanted to talk about like how do you help a church and believers transition into missional living, like gospel-centered missional living, which you have been a major pioneer in that. And we also wanted to talk about pilot groups, which is a thing that we've been at Saturate been kind of challenging, calling people to do as a way to help do that. And you guys have taken that idea and run with it and enhanced it. And so, yeah, so maybe the first thing to talk about is just, what's it like helping people in the Midwest in the context that you just described, helping them begin to see the mission of God as everyday life?
Oh, man. Great question. Because, and what I love about Saturate, what I love jumping on when I first heard about it, was this full-fledged call to every disciple to be full-fledged in every part of their life in following Christ. And is your heart, is your soul, is your mind, is your strength all given to following Jesus? And I think the first realization you have to grapple with is I'm working with, and the conservative side of people, the conservatives here in Iowa, I think most of them would say, I'm living a pretty good Christian life. And yet inside of that, when you look at what they're actually doing, a lot of people, they may go to church. We see a lot of people coming into our church with broken relationships and marriages. We see divorce and struggles with children. We see younger people just feeling lost and not sure how they fit into culture and society. And so the younger, more post-Christian side, you see a lot of people that just, they don't even understand the narrative of our culture anymore. We're seeing a lot of people that are older in Christ coming into our church, but they bear little fruit of following Jesus. They look at their life and you say, I just don't see much fruit here. At first we've been preaching the Bible faithfully for years here. And so I think there's kind of this frustration of like, man, we're saying this up front. We're telling people to follow Jesus. Why aren't they following Jesus? What's going on? And when you look at how Jesus did it, he clearly taught, he clearly made bold proclamations in front of many people during his ministry. He also called people into relationship and everyday life with him. And so we quickly realized early on we needed to call people, a full-fledged disciple, and discipling people to follow Jesus. It's something that isn't just taught, it's taught. So we wanted people to experience that. And I think that's the real challenge with the way a lot of churches are set up, including ours, is we're preaching faithfully on Sunday. We're celebrating, pointing people to Jesus on Sundays. But some of the gaps that they really have are in, how does this actually look? Like, what does everyday life look like? And we started to realize there was gaps keeping them from getting even into groups. And so people would come in. This week, I just sat down with a guy who just went through pilot groups, and I was asking him, how did it go? We're learning, we're growing. I'd like to hear both criticism and praise. And he said, he's a conservative Christian all his life. He said, I've never been in a small group that wasn't all men and was not led by a pastor. That was his experience. And I was like, wow, because that's obviously not my experience. That's not what we're going for here. So for him, he'd been coming to our church for 4 years. And we had been telling him, he's like, you guys would always tell us, get into groups and you talk about it and you'd use the illustrations. But he was like, it was just terrifying. It was really uncomfortable for me to like go to a stranger's home that I didn't know. I was coming to church on Sunday, hearing something. I didn't have good relationships with other people at church. And so I felt awkward being inviting myself. I had these barriers to getting in. And that's been interesting for me, is to realize that I think there's a lot of people that are coming, that they're kind of in that space, like they would be with Jesus, where they're intrigued by the message. They're listening to this. They go, wow, this is more than just an intellectual belief system. This is Christ is calling me to follow him with every part of my life. And they make some attempts, but they're often alone. They get frustrated and discouraged, and then they don't move forward. And so we had to realize as a church, how do we really not just tell people to jump into groups, but how do we help them experience this and move and help them take some steps? So it's, maybe you were to say they're looking at getting over into like jumping into a full-fledged community following Jesus. And it's like, there's maybe it's like a 10 or 15 foot creek they have to get across, and they're scared of getting wet and they don't know how deep the creek is. And we had to realize we have to create some stepping stones to help them kind of get across and down this path. And so pilot groups is really just that. It's trying to both teach them, but also just have them experience what biblical community, what true community following Jesus looks like, and do it in a way that would be a little easier for them to jump into.
Right. I think that's pretty insightful. I think as pastors, we can also often get super excited about ideas and then forget that it took us like 20 steps in our mind to get to those ideas. And that a like 35-minute sermon or even an 8-week sermon series isn't going to like shift people to like the shifts that we've experienced over years. And so you guys you're recognizing that, but at the same time realizing, oh man, people need that bridge, and then someone to hold their hand across that bridge to even just step into some of these things.
Right. And that's even what is modeled, I think, in the New Testament scriptures. You see that where there is bold calls, absolutely, from the front. And Jesus even personally made bold calls. But then there's also a pathway that he walked people down.
Right.
And we're still learning on this as well. We're kind of calling them guides right now, of just saying, even in how a church connects people to groups, there's been a lot of systems and structures you set up, but we feel like the core of our church is we want to disciple people. And so we want people to experience that as soon as possible. So even on Sundays, right now, what we're working towards is someone wants something. They want prayer. They want to get into a group, whatever it is. We're trying to have trained guides, people that are mature in their own walk with Christ, that can work and connect with that person immediately right there and start, if they need prayer, they're getting prayer right there. And then that person says, so, what's your community? What are you, who are you with? And then starting a connection, a relationship with them immediately there, so that when, that person then calls them, that guide calls them the next week, they already have a face. They already know who that person is. And they have a connection to them.
Yeah.
So we're trying to build that in. I think that's, big churches, you can get so caught up in all these systems to move people in. And a lot of times from the new person experience, we're seeing most of the people in our big church, they're coming in and they have some area they feel broken in. Their marriage is in trouble. They're empty and depressed. They are struggling with some deep area of sin in their life, and they're terrified to tell anyone about it. And so they come to church, and I kind of feel they're similar to like the woman who is bleeding, and they're just hoping to touch the hem of Jesus's robe, and maybe they'll get healing. And yet there's so much of a fuller picture for that woman. Yes, Jesus wanted to heal her, but he actually had a whole life he was calling her into. And we don't know her story for sure, but that's, the theme of the church is, yes, we do want to get you healing, but you've been called to the beauty and the delight of following Jesus and in your whole life and experiencing that. So we want that for you, not just immediate healing for some issue,
right?
Which is great. We'll start there, because that often is how God brings us into a place of humility to follow him. But long term, we want you to have this beauty, this delight of following Jesus in every part of your life.
Yeah, man, that's so big, because I think that often like the structures, the systems that we put in place kind of like shift to one of those, like even I think Soma, the family of churches that birthed Saturate, one of the things that we've realized and had to repent over the last several years is that people would come in hurting and broken. We'd be like, all right, well, you've got to be like, we want you to be a Green Beret Special Forces disciple. If you can't cut it, like, this isn't the church for you, kind of thing. And without even giving space to finding out even the hidden sin and woundedness that people had. And that was like that's the most egregious stereotype of what we were doing. But there's truth in that. And then I think the other extreme is to say like, no, like, we just want you to come in, sit down, like, be comfortable. Over 25 years, maybe you'll get some fruit and health in your life. We don't want to push you to make you too uncomfortable because you might leave.
Right.
But I love what you're saying is it's like, no, like, people come to us broken and we want to meet them there and disciple them there, because that's how we all come. That's the starting point for every disciple. But we want to see them. We want a different trajectory for them.
Right. Well, that's what's interesting. And Jesus also encountered proud people. And boy, I can be in that category, and people coming in the door can be in that category of just not willing to, like, we all have brokenness. It's there. This is doctrinally, we know this, right? We know that we're broken, but getting to that point of realization, saying, yeah, we're broken. That's what I think keeps a lot of people from jumping into churches, is that it is so hard to admit that base need that's there. But to me, that's oftentimes what motivates someone to come in the door and to even launch to get help, is the realization of that brokenness. So God definitely uses that. But the difficult people are the people that are too proud to admit that, or maybe they come, but they can't admit they need help. And then they're terrified of being known, because then people will find out what's really going on. That's the interesting one at churches where people come and sit, is I think there's for some people, probably their deepest brokenness is that pride that's sitting there saying, I have this figured out. I just need to fill in this information gap in my head. Yeah. And then I can move back to living independently and free and doing what I want with my life. Whereas, the gospel says we're too broken. we're meant to be in this family, in this community of God, and our brokenness has led us to be fractured and separate.
Yeah.
And so we're being called back into this community and body. So we're trying to give people that feel, but it can be hard. And I think there's, we puzzle over a lot why people don't get engaged. And I think there's various reasons, but we're like you, we're kind of repenting and growing as we go. But what I see the themes of Jesus when he encountered broken people is he ministered at that deep heart level to those wounds. And then like the woman at the well, you see them with joy going out to the community and telling everyone about what Jesus had did for them, which is, again, a great example of humility of someone who's like, here's my junk. Here's what Jesus said to me. And this is the life change that happened from it. So we feel like with those broken people and those brokenness there, Jesus does take time to stop and listen, and we should too. And oftentimes those people, as they receive healing, will be the ones that will not stop talking about it to anyone,
Absolutely.
So I think but that takes time sometimes,
Yeah. And I think that, man, that's such a good principle. And so, and you did mention, like that, like there's some guide there to like pray for them, but also point them forward as like a practical thing. What are other ways that you guys practically build that bridge for people?
So we have some interesting challenges because we have a church that people are still coming in, not knowing other people well at the church. So it'd be one thing if they were just coming in and they had a mature Christian that they're a friend of, and then you just kind of work with that friend to make sure that they're getting connected in. We're having a lot of people here come in that don't have deep relational connections with anyone. They just hear about it. They're like, we hear you're a Bible preaching church. We hear, you talk about the gospel, and I want that. So I want to come here. And so that's all they know. So what we've had to do is try to really study who the people are coming in and realize that there's different, like an introvert is going to come in the doors of a church differently than an extrovert, And so we have to make ways for all these different types of personalities that are coming in the door that want to know more or want to, and there's people that just don't want to know more. They want to come in, they want to leave. And it can be easy to even make assumptions about them, where they at. Some of them want to hear the preaching for a while and just get comfortable with, do I doctrinally, do I agree with this? Other people, coming in broken and will tell you right away. And there's people that are coming in enthused and energetic and running down this pathway. So what we're doing is we try to have at both of our locations regular meals on site at church after service. And we invite people to meals. We call them getting to know grace. Yes, there's a double meaning. You can criticize the cliche, but it's worked for a long time, so we just do it. And so we have a meal. We have them sit at tables. We have guides at those tables that are just kind of, drawing people out, getting to know their story. And the goal is to really just understand and we don't perfectly accomplish this, but we're trying to shoot towards three things. We want to remind them of the story of God, which that's a long story. So we have an abbreviated version. And then we want to hear their story. And then we want them to know our story of what us imperfectly following Jesus has looked like as a church. So we'll just try to do some entry points there. And then from there, as those guides are at those tables talking to people, they'll get kind of a feel of where that person is at. It's always interesting to ask, why did you come to the lunch? They come to the service. Why do you want to come to the lunch? And, most commonly, our most common thing is people want community. About 60% of the people that come to that want community. We do have an older demographic here that define that differently. They would call that they were looking for a men or women's Bible study. And so a lot of people that are a little older are looking for that. And so we didn't have a conversation. We've allowed, while we don't have staff really leading those, we do have some people that have just self-started some Bible studies, and that's fine. And that can be even a form of welcoming and caring for new people, plus also for each other. I mean, it's no problem going deep in the Word. But of course, as you and I know, that's not the full expression of community we're looking for. And then we have pilot groups then twice a year, and we're doing those for 10-week increments. And we had to look at the seasonal life of our church. So our church definitely has seasons. I don't know. We're a 4-season culture here. So even in the weather, we tend to follow that a little bit. And then we follow the school system. Those are our 2 dominant rhythms that we have through our year. And so for us, we have the most people flowing in, wanting to get involved and connected in the fall, right as school starts. And so we have one pilot group that 10 weeks that will launch right then. So we'll do a welcoming lunch and then move them right into pilot groups. And then we do another in the spring. And we'll see kind of leading up to Easter, another group of people coming in more interested at that time. So we're really targeting especially people that just have had trouble connecting into groups, and we're trying to help move them forward. If we encounter people early on that know people in groups, we always try to encourage them to stay with that person, the person that they're with. We're not trying to recruit them, because a lot of times there's been a relationship formed for years and someone's invited someone to church. How frustrating then to get that person recruited into another group. So we always try to encourage them, if they have existing relationship, towards that relationship first. And then if for some reason that's been challenging, they could come to a pilot group. But if you don't have relationship and you want to be in a group, great. One thing I have seen actually with people, even existing relationships, is, and this can be a problem with mission communities can have all sorts of issues. Is one is that they will come in and sense the tight knittedness of that group, and will have a hard time breaking in and feeling like really understood and part of that group. Now, some groups do fantastic at being aware of that. I think even some gift sets, like if you have an evangelist in your group or someone who maybe thinks a little apostolically, that person may really do great at bridging that person in. But sometimes you come into a group that has a teacher and a shepherd and they're like, I don't feel like this group is so tight knit and they just love each other and they're so awesome, but I don't know if I fit in. So we're always working with our groups to help them be aware of that. But sometimes they end up in a pilot group just because they want to kind of start over with a new group and be part of that vision and that structure from the get-go.
That's awesome. That's so good. And yeah, that makes like tons of sense, even just in each of those points, giving people grace, no pun intended. And then also giving them like the next kind of step across that bridge. That's awesome. Yeah. Maybe tell us what a pilot group is and how that gets worked out, like some of the nitty gritty of that.
Yeah. So pilot group is basically just, again, if you don't have a group you can connect with, it's a way to get into community and get trained and get some idea of what to do. We don't ask for a commitment up front beyond just the 8 weeks. And then, but the whole goal is to have people not just hear about groups, sit in a teaching about groups, but actually get to experience group life in kind of a third space environment, someplace where it's a little bit more neutral to them than someone's home. And so we actually have pilot groups on site at our church. And what we do is we just clear our auditorium. We bring tables in. The first week we put out a really big spread, tons of food, and just try to be really hospitable. And then I'll get into this for a second. But what we wanted to do is just start to experience what it is, though, to sit around a table or in a living room or wherever this is offsite. That feeling of just sharing some of your life, just little pieces of your life, with each other, and move people kind of into that experience. So pilot groups, the actual teaching structure of it, we just follow the Saturate field guide. So we actually hand out the field guides and use those for 8 weeks. And so we teach through what the Saturate field guides, the content there. And what I love about that is you lay a gospel foundation. You help people understand that God meant us to be family and missionaries and servants. But what's the basis of that? So you have to lay that foundation with people. For us in Iowa, that is a pretty revolutionary concept. I know it's a very ancient concept, an important one, but a lot of people have not. They are still in the church as a is a building and a meeting, and that they're not much beyond that. Or even if they give it lip service that the church is a body of people, they have their ecclesiology is not very robust. So I love the Saturate Foundation built there. Frankly, I'm even after walking people through this now, they're still not getting it. They get through 8 weeks and they're still basic things that I'm like, oh, they don't get this yet. and I think some of it is, it just takes time, like you said earlier, and people learn differently. I've been really trying to learn how adults learn. I'm trying to learn how adults learn. That sounds awesome. Adults learn differently, and a lot of times they have to have a need and be motivated to meet that, to figure out, what they don't know. And so you have to kind of prick them and help them understand they don't know something. The core of what we're doing then is following that guide, helping them understand what the church is, and then calling them to live that out. In the last several weeks, get much more practical. And how do we actually live this out? So by the end, the last 2 weeks especially, the groups are really starting to make plans. They've already been doing some things outside of group by that time, but by the end 2 weeks, they're starting to make plans then about, okay, what does this look like if we go into our living rooms now? So it's really a prep. And one big advantage of it too is that you have a core of a group instead of just a leader. So we used to do our leadership training where you just take a leader. And at first, we didn't even provide childcare because we were dumb, and so we would have oftentimes just a male leader without even his wife, or sometimes we'd have the woman come. So they weren't even as a couple on the same page. So we'd give them training in what to do groups, and then they have to go back and bring their spouse into this, and then the two of them have to go and convince a group this is what we're doing. So a pilot group brings, I would definitely say one thing I got pushed back here and fought for, and I'm really glad I did, was make sure you offer great childcare, make sure the kids are enjoying themselves. And it's such a blessing to have the husband and wife together. And we had a lot of young couples that probably couldn't have done it if they couldn't have come to this. So we do offer childcare just to give their undivided attention. Yeah. And so we teach them through that. And another thing I'll say is what I did is the teaching content that came with the field guide was probably close to an hour of upfront teaching, at least the pace that I teach. It was probably an hour for me. So I had to cut back the upfront teaching. I probably only taught about 15 minutes a week and just tried to be very concise, very on point, and go after what I wanted, because what I wanted to do is have people telling their stories every week. We had people coming in, they would eat together first. As they ate, they started talking about their week. Then they got into each other's stories. So someone would share their story. And so we just used the Telling Your Story with Jesus as the hero resource, and just started training them how to see the gospel in their own story, and then how to draw it out from each other as a group. We had table leaders already pre-selected that we felt were pretty qualified to lead community groups. And so I worked with them prior to that and actually knew their stories, had walked them through it. And so then they were walking their tables through that because of the training that they had gotten. They got to know each other's stories. They got to eat together. And then we started pushing them early on to try to do things like communicate outside of the group. That's one little detail that was really helpful right from the get-go, is I told every group to figure out their style of communication. I just gave them ideas. Some people use Facebook. They start a group. Other people text. Text is awful, but if you want to do that, fine. I hate group text. They drive me crazy. But if that's your thing, do that thing. That's what your group agrees on, whatever that is. And that was crazy because they gelled. From that week on, I had people come up to me, hey, so-and-so wants to let me know that they can't make it this week, but they'll be back next week. They wouldn't even contact me. They would just tell their group what was going on. And so people started sharing requests. They started hanging out outside of group because they had each other's contact information. So even sharing that week one was a really big win, and encouraging them giving them ideas of things to do, ways to serve. So when you get into being a missionary, being a servant, being family, well, there's just natural application.
Right.
Well, you guys should go have another meal this week because you're family. That's what families do. You guys should figure out how to serve each other or serve someone in the community this week, because that's what servants do. And what does it look like to hold an event that your unchristian friends, not an event, but a hangout or something that your unchristian friends can come to. What does that look like? What would it look like to get to know each other's unchristian friends and start praying and caring for them? Just little things like that you can give them to do. But all of that is then forming community. They're really starting to move into a family feel as they do those things together.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I realized that we started about halfway through, because I just realized that as we're doing this, is that a lot of people did not know how to pray, and they didn't know how to pray out loud. So we stopped one time and just taught that for 10 minutes of how to pray, and then recognized that there's so many people that were like, that was actually one thing that people in their comments said is like, I was terrified to go to a community group because I was terrified someone would ask me to pray that night. And you guys teaching us how to do that and modeling how to do that really helped me.
Oh, that's cool.
So it's funny, the things that I wouldn't think of as maybe being, if I were coming to a new church, that probably wouldn't be something I would worry about.
Right.
But for them, that was a big deal. So
that's awesome. Wow. Yeah. That's just like, you're kind of guiding people, helping them walk through some of the very early stages of a community existing. Like, how are we going to communicate? Like, just very like basics of like, even like Christian community, like how are we going to pray together, but also casting vision for how this could evolve. That's so great. Maybe kind of like the last question is, what kind of fruit have you seen? Even just kind of like anecdotally as you've been doing this.
Well, I didn't expect this. We're seeing people come to Jesus. I kind of was under the assumption that most of these people had already kind of made a decision to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
And what we were finding is that we I want to be careful not to share stories without permission here.
Yeah.
There was people that were coming to church that had deep-rooted sin issues. And it's like they were just covering it up. They just had like layers of bandages over this wound that they had. Not literal wound, but a spiritual, this sin in their life. And so, we had trained our group leaders to share their story and to not hold back on. That's one common part of Scripture is people will skip the idea of that they're fallen and broken.
Right.
And they'll just kind of go, I grew up and had a pretty decent family, or maybe a dysfunctional family, whatever the story is. But they won't, if it's dysfunctional, they won't go into it. And every family has some dysfunction.
Right.
And then they don't really go into any other things. And then I decided to come to church here. And you're like, I don't really know you right now.
Right.
That's not really the full story. My own background is I grew up as a pastor's kid and oscillated from being really, really good or really, really bad. And so I both had seasons of rebellion in my life where I was definitely the prodigal kid, and then other seasons where I was like trying desperately to be the self-righteous person, but I did not understand the grace and mercy of Christ in my own life.
Yeah.
And so the turning point was when I just started being able to realize that both that self-righteous hypocrisy I had and also, and I'm still in this process of God revealing to me just ways I'm self-righteous and independent. And yet on the other side, also learning how to confess and say, I'm deeply broken and have these sin and rebellious instincts to run away from God. So once I saw that, then the mercies of Christ became plain, and I was like, I need God badly, And so we wanted people to hear their stories from that perspective. There were several people that I believe have become Christ followers now, even in our last one we just did, last pilot groups, that I just think as they heard stories, they were blown away. They're like, the common thing I heard was, I didn't know anyone else in the church struggled with this. And so to hear someone in a leadership position share so vulnerably and then show me Jesus, I was so hungry for Jesus. Like I want, like the thing is I want Jesus. It's the, like the woman in the well, they give me this living water, I desperately need this. It was unbelievable because we would get done and oftentimes me or one of the tables might be there for another 45 minutes or longer ministering to someone who's just that we had some people that just were overwhelmed. So that was the first thing I was really surprised at. I didn't expect, but was delighted that it happened. The other thing is that for us, every single group has continued on. Every single table made it all the way through, and is going on. So we had a bunch of new communities start up across the city as a result of that. So the last time we had 7 tables that made it through, of about 6 to 8 people each table.
That's awesome.
So I just feel somewhat better too, because you have a core community that's all in it together and has made some covenants now towards what the next year looks like.
Right.
And so, I'm sure there's going to be ups and downs with that. We're going to continue to coach and shepherd them, but that's just it's one of the probably most encouraging startups to launch new groups that we've ever done.
That's so cool.
So I'm really excited about that. And then I think also just there's been, in my mind, just thinking about all the people that are coming up to me and sharing really intimate things of their life, even if they are following Christ, they're just going deeper into that devotion of Christ. And, at the core, what should link a missional community is we are all devoted to following Christ because of our great need for him and our great desire and joy in knowing him. And I'm seeing that happen, and that brings me delight. It makes me so happy.
That's so cool. Wow, that's awesome. I mean, we talk about structures and like, oh, we want everyone to be a disciple, but I think sometimes we forget just like transformation. Yeah. So that's really exciting and so good. That's great. And I think that, I don't know if you have anything else to share about that. You like left out some really great nuggets on just practical steps. And if people want to, they can get the pilot guide that will help people kind of set up their own version of that. And, highly recommend people to take from even just your learning that you just shared, Dan, and have people, incorporate that as well as kind of read their own context. But that's so great.
One thing I would just say is to leaders that are thinking about pilot groups is I just so love and appreciate the content that Saturate's done for the field with the field guides and everything. But you also need to really make sure that you're aligned at your church level on what making disciples looks like, because it can feel weird to people if you use just Saturate content without that being used anywhere else in your church.
That's such a good point.
And so I would also just say, as you're considering this, there's a lot of the language that Saturate uses that is our language, and so we don't worry about that. That's great. We just use it. But there was other things along the way too that we had to just make sure we slowed down and clearly communicated in our language what we meant. So one thing I'd say going into it is I think a mistake I can see people is to kind of pull something like the field guide off the shelf and kind of go, this is going to do everything. There's actually a lot of work at that leadership level of just making sure, is this aligned with our church? And that can obviously lead to even deeper questions of, is our church properly aligned to what Christ has called us to do? But as you have that, make sure as a leader that you just are thoughtfully thinking through, what are those core areas of discipleship that you're trying to disciple people in?
Yeah.
What are those core identities? Like I've settled on and really love the Somic identities, but there's a lot of identities thrown out in the New Testament.
Right.
And so I understand why we use the 3 and Saturate that we do and love that, because there's so many implications. But there's a lot you can think through.
Right.
We went back and forth on using ambassador versus missionary,
right?
Because we just wondered about, do we see missionaries as these commissioned ones that are sent out overseas that God has specially called to cross cultures, and while I love the concept of missionary, is that confusing to people to tell them that they're missionaries when, 2 Corinthians 5 use the word ambassadors. That's often one I teach from. So I think things like that as a leader are really critical to think through and have ownership of. And then I will give you confidence too, as you lead it, of like, hey, we're being faithful to what Christ has called us to do here locally, and we're using these materials to help us get there. And I think if you do that, you'll do well.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a great word too. That's such a good reminder of of what we mean when we mean make it your own, but also how to just think of it holistically in your whole church. That it's not just like, oh, there's this really weird pilot group thing happening in room 502 over there. So it has nothing to do with the rest of us. Yeah, that's really core. Awesome, Dan. Thanks so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation, and honestly, it's going to encourage so many people just hearing and like just the practicality of it, but also the vision that you've cast for being patient and gracious with people while still calling them to everything that Jesus has for them and delight in following Jesus. So love that. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thanks for having me, Brad.
Today's podcast was edited by Ben Fort, and our theme music is written and performed by the band Mopac. Saturate's hope is to see one missional community for every 1,000 people in every city as we see the glory of God fill every person, every place, and every church. We participate in this vision by curating resources, training, coaching, consulting, and many more ways. Find out more at saturatetheworld.com.